What's up, guys? Welcome back to another cosplay tutorial video. And first, I just want to say thank you so much for 200 subscribers. I really appreciate your support as I grow this channel. And even if 200 isn't a crazy big number, it still makes me happy just to know that I can help other cosplayers. If you're new here, thanks for stopping by. Hopefully you'll find this video helpful and you'll subscribe as well. Today I'll be showing you how I made my gloves for my cosplay of Orphea from Heroes of the Storm. And if you're not making this cosplay, no worries. There's plenty of general information for you here on how to make any cuffed glove, as well as just the standard glove itself. So let's get right into it.
Let's start with the actual gloves. I'll be using a very basic method of glove making. Remember when you were a kid and you'd make little hand turkeys for Thanksgiving? Yep, we're transferring that skill into our cosplay. I've traced my hand onto just some regular sketch paper to use as a pattern. With the initial hand tracing, I'm following the curves of my fingers exactly, and then after tracing, I go back around and add a tiny bit of seam allowance, roughly 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, around the tracing. When using this method, you have to have a stretch fabric. At least 2-way stretch, although 4-way stretch is going to be the easiest fabric to use. I'm using a black 2-way stretch fabric today. I'm transferring my pattern onto the fabric by pinning it down and tracing the outline using a white pen. You can also use tailor's chalk or a white colored pencil to transfer patterns. If your fabric has a defined front and back, you'll want both front-facing sides to be touching each other during this, so you're just working with the wrong side of the fabric. It's also important that if you're using a 2-way stretch material, that your fabric stretches along the width of your glove and not the length. If you're worried about it not being stretchy enough, you can also turn your pattern diagonally so that it sits on the bias of the fabric. With your pattern transferred, you can now sew along that line with your sewing machine. I pinned my fabric together to keep it from slipping around. This is easier than cutting out the pattern and then sewing it, as it cuts down on the chance of missing a stitch through both pieces. And like you normally would, I'm starting and ending the stitch by back stitching. As I approach each fingertip of my glove, I slow down my stitching and use the wheel on the side to precisely place my stitches. If you just trust the machine to feed the fabric as you stitch, you can end up with jagged stitches later. At this point, you can slip your hand in and test the fit. If there are any fit issues, now would be a good time to fix that. If you're happy, you can cut out around your stitching, leaving less than 1/8 of an inch from your cut to the stitch line. After cutting it out, try your glove on again with it still inside out, and double check to make sure your machine hasn't missed any stitches and that everything fits correctly. With my gloves still inside out, I folded over the wrist area to create somewhat of a wristband to help hold my glove in place on my hand. I pinned it in place and I stitched over that with a single straight stitch, stretching the fabric out as I stitch so it holds some elasticity when I go to put it on. So if you're just trying to make your simple standard glove, that is basically it. Now I'm going to go into how I made the fancy detailed cuff for my glove, starting with the pattern. Looking at the cuff, I can tell it goes about 1/3 of the way up the character's forearm. I measured this on my own forearm and decided I wanted a finished cuff length of 4 inches. I added an additional inch for seam allowance as I wanted to have plenty of fabric to work with for attaching it to my glove. I also know that this piece is going to have a bit of a puff outward at the wrist, and for this reason I'm making the cuff all one width rather than making it kind of cone shaped. I measured around both the thickest part of my palm and thumb, as well as the spot on my arm where the cuff would end, and used those measurements to determine how big around my cuff should be. I wanted to both be able to fit my hand into the glove easily, as well as have a bit of a gap between my forearm and the end of the cuff. I also considered a 1/2-inch seam allowance on each side. The length I decided to use was 11 inches. This is the pattern for the fabric on the inside of the cuff. Using this 11 by 5 inch rectangle, I figured how big I wanted my gold trim to be. I looked at the reference and noticed that it came down about 1/3 of the way on the cuff. I wanted a long seam allowance on the inside of the trim, about 3/4 of an inch. There are also these gold straps that wrap from the inside to the outside of the cuff. To figure out the width, I compared it to the reference and held a measuring tape up to my arm to decide on a measurement. I went with 2 inches wide, which includes the 1/4 inch seam allowance. We can always trim a piece shorter, so I just made sure it was a safe enough length, 7.5 inches, and I cut my pieces out. To get a clean curve for the end of my strap, I used a small lid that was the same diameter of my strap, and I used that to trace the end, and then I cut it out. For the outside of the cuff, I needed to stitch together 4 pieces of fabric. I determined the size by dividing the length of my inside cuff pattern by 4, then adding a 1/4 inch seam allowance on either side of the piece where it would be stitched together. So that's 4 rectangles that are 3.25 inches by 5 inches. The fabric I'm using is a purple velour fabric purchased from Joann. I transferred my patterns to the fabric by drawing them with a Sharpie on the wrong side of the fabric and then cut them out. I then pinned my outside cuff pieces together to make one long piece again, and I stitched those closed to connect the pieces. After stitching, I pressed my seams flat. After that, I ironed on a piece of thin interfacing to help give the cuff some structure. This interfacing has an adhesive that holds it in place and essentially fuses the pieces together. I cut my strap pieces from 4-way stretch Yaya Han pleather, which honestly, I love. It's just the most perfect gold color. I pinned them together right along the edges and stitched them together. Just like with the fingertips on the gloves, I made sure to stitch slowly and carefully around the rounded edge. I also cut a piece of vinyl to structure the inside. It doesn't matter what your vinyl looks like, you can really use any kind. I cut the vinyl piece just a bit smaller than the gold pieces so it would fit snugly inside of the strap. I trimmed a bit off of my strap pattern piece and traced it with a pen onto the back side of the strap to use as a sewing guideline. I then pinned through all 3 layers of the fabric to hold the vinyl in place while stitching. I didn't want extra pin marks in my gold fabric, so I used paper clips to hold them in place as I kind of mocked up how I was going to sew the cuff. This is going to be a different process depending on your cuff design. Using non-penetrating tools on vinyl is important unless you want little holes all over your fabric. You can also use binder clips or quilting clips for this, but I'm a broke bitch, so I used paper clips. For the gold trim, I had a 3/4 seam allowance, which I folded over inside. After setting up my gold fabric, I figured out where to place my strap. The strap needed to sit over the top of the gold trim and slip inside without extra stitching. I placed the strap where I wanted it to sit on the front and held it together as I flipped it over and placed it where it needed to be on the back. I trimmed the excess off the end of the strap and slipped it inside of the gold edge, then stitched it in place with a tight zigzag stitch for a professional finished look. I put a bit of batting inside the edge of my cuff to give the outside edge more dimension. Making sure I placed the fabric exactly where I wanted it, I pinned it down. I then used a tight zigzag stitch to cover it up. So for the little round gold details on this cuff, you could use gold buttons and stitch them on. However, since this is a competition piece and because I wanted to use as many materials as I had on hand rather than buying more things, I just made my own. These started as paper brads. I covered them with a thermoplastic, which in specific it was Thybra, and hand shaped them. I then painted, weathered, and sealed them with Mod Podge. If you'd like more info on how I made these, leave a comment and I can go into more detail here. But because this video is already pretty long, I'll just leave it at that. I marked off where I wanted the brads placed and I went ahead and I installed them. Because the brad backing is metal, it stays pretty secure without slipping around, so there was no need for glue here. I then trimmed off the bit of excess on either side of the front cuff piece. I pinned the sides together and then stitched the cuff closed. We're almost there. I also stitched the cuff closed at the opening. All that's left is to stitch the cuff to the glove. I did this by simply flipping the cuff so that the right side of the cuff was against the right side of the glove and sewing it on. You want to make sure that you put these on correctly so you have the strap facing the correct direction for both the left hand and the right hand.
So there you have it. That's how I made my gloves. If this video was helpful for you, please leave a like down below. And if you know anybody who totally struggles with gloves, you should totally share this with them. My question for you today is, what is the biggest struggle that you have faced so far with cosplay? Leave a comment down below and let me know. My next convention is Anime St. Louis in the first weekend of May, so I'm going to start getting pretty busy because that's like 2 months out from now, but I want to continue uploading every other week for you guys. If you want to keep up on my progress on Orphea on social media, those links will be down in the description below, and make sure to subscribe for more cosplay content in the future!